Hey, how are you?
Hey, I am doing great. I just got home from work, and I'll tell you what, for the first time in like 3 weeks, I am caught up. I
Ooh,
cannot believe it. Yes, it feels wonderful. So I'm sure I will have plenty of things
nice.
to do when I walk in the door tomorrow, but for right now, I am caught up.
Oh, congratulations. That feels so good.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. So, how are you?
Well, I have to say, I don't know if this is a good day or a bad day, but I'll say that it is a significant day in
Oh,
the life of Josh from Missouri.
okay.
For the first time in my entire life, I am wearing reading glasses. I have hit
Oh,
a certain age.
yes. I got reading glasses just before I entered seminary, so I don't know what I would have been, 38. And I'll tell you, that made all the difference in the world. I still wear the same pair of reading glasses, and I cannot read without them, both because I cannot see very well without them, and because it's just there's something about the experience of putting on the reading glasses that you're like, okay, I'm doing this now.
It is interesting. I did not realize how much I was straining my eyes until I pulled up Threads because that's one of the things I look at the most words on my phone.
Mm.
And I looked at it with glasses on and I was like, oh, 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 that was bad.
Oh,
Um, so I have officially entered the age where I will now have to buy like 15 pairs of reading glasses because I'll lose them all over the place. And there'll be one pair everywhere and I won't be able to find any of them. And it'll turn out that I'll have 8 of them on my head.
this is awesome. So Shelly just got a brand new pair of glasses, and it's the customizable ones where you can like magnetically attach a new face to them anytime you want
Oh,
to.
yeah.
And so she has like a new look every single day with her glasses. And so maybe you could just go for the same thing, just with multiple pairs.
Well, I tell you what, it's funny. So my wife as well used to have those glasses, the kind where you could kind of change the face all the time.
Yeah.
She wore them kayaking once. The face blew right off and she
Oh,
returned them.
okay.
So I don't recommend them kayaking is my point.
And it's just the
You know,
face that blew off of him, like the whole.
correct.
Okay,
The face blew off the rest of them. Yes.
okay,
So,
interesting.
so yeah, I know you guys kayak, so
Yes, we do.
just a word of warning.
Okay. Well, all right. So this episode, though, I've got kind of a treat for us.
Ooh.
So we had a longtime listener who's been listening to the show since day one reach out to us and say, "Hey, I've actually been wondering about baptism. Could you all talk about baptism?" And this is great because I don't think on our own we would have thought to talk about this.
Yeah, I love that topic. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. And so his question was specifically, is baptism something that can only happen once? Right? It's fairly common for people who get the opportunity to go to Israel to choose to be rebaptized in the Jordan River. Or there might be other instances in which somebody might choose to be rebaptized or want to explore the idea of being rebaptized. And is that quote unquote allowed? Is that okay? And I suspect you, having served as a pastor for 20 years, you have had this conversation with at least one person.
I've had this conversation so many times from a purely practical pastoral vantage point. It's funny when you texted me a little bit about this so that we could do some preparing, and I realized, despite the fact that I have had this conversation dozens of times, I had never taken the time to make sure that my answer was theologically consistent with the rest of what I think.
Mm,
And so I am thrilled to have this conversation because It's so easy to have a convenient pastoral answer, and especially when you've given the same answer a bunch of times. Honestly, at some point you stop thinking about it. It's just, oh yeah, I know the answer to this. Like, here's my answer. It's, you know, I use the same illustrations and the same, I can get it down to about 2 minutes and then I'm done. But
Okay.
that is not necessarily the best. The most important thing is to make sure you're theologically consistent. So I may have some practical thoughts on this, but I want to make you the theological watchdog here to aim for consistency. Like, are we thinking theologically about this well?
Okay. Okay. Well, the whole premise of our friendship is that I'm supposed to be standing by waiting to tell you when you're an idiot. So
Yes.
I guess that is what we're going to do today. You're going to talk and I'm going to tell you when you're being an idiot.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and as I give you my kind of stock answer to this, the first question, and I'm telling you in advance because I have actually struggled with this. What are the theological issues in play when I say what I'm about to say? Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah. Well, I would love for you just to dive into it. And yeah, I
Yeah.
will absolutely keep that question in mind.
Exactly. Yes. So here's, generally speaking, here is what I say whenever somebody has ever asked me this. It's pretty simple. I just say, it's important to remember baptism is a symbol of the beginning of your spiritual journey. And so if you are looking at this particular moment, normally I'm having this conversation like the day before somebody wants to get baptized again. If you would consider this moment the beginning of your spiritual journey, and somehow what came before this was not authentic or real, and you want to be baptized again, that's totally fine. But if that was the beginning of your spiritual journey, you don't get baptized again because that really was authentically the beginning of your journey. And it may be that that was the beginning of your journey and then you took a really long detour and now you're here, and that's okay. That was still the beginning of your journey. So, and then I just always end up asking them, what do you think? Do you feel like you started your spiritual journey back then? Or do you feel like you're starting your spiritual journey right now? And what do we need to do because of that? That's kind of my answer.
I think as a go-to pastoral answer, this is great. I think it
Yeah.
is probably clarifying for a lot of people in that moment. If I could zoom out though and ask not ask a broader question, but just thinking about my own context. I think like a symphony, my life has had various movements. And I would not say that I accepted Christ at the age of, say, 35, but there was a substantial spiritual shift for me that began at around age 35 that catapulted me forward, and I'm still experiencing the benefits of it today. And so that's not the beginning of my spiritual life, but it is a beginning of sorts. And so could baptism be a symbol of kind of a rebirth? Not even a rebirth. Like I never stopped following Jesus, but maybe the beginning of a new chapter.
This is a great question. See, and I think you're hitting on something that we don't do well in America, which is we don't always have ceremonies for marking time well.
Hmm.
If we celebrated your spiritual birthday every year and baptism was sort of an early part of that, you would assume you would be growing every year. You wouldn't be looking for, like, you wouldn't need something tell you, yes, this is special and significant.
Right.
But I think really what most of the time, what I think people are trying to say when they say, can I get baptized again, is this is a spiritually significant moment in my life, and I need to mark that somehow.
Hmm.
And so for me, my concern that like pastorally is we call baptism the beginning of the journey. I think there is something not even spiritually, but just emotionally complicated, or in the general area of mental health, that's complicated about denying one's own past and story and saying, no, this is the beginning.
Sure.
So, like, and again, if somebody came to me and said what you just said and wanted to get baptized, I would happily and joyfully baptize them if I were their pastor. So, I don't feel strongly about it. I just want to always wrestle with this tension of how do we mark this moment special without denying what has come before it and seeing it as an outgrowth of that, if possible.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I like what you're saying about the continuation of the journey, and you don't want to make today's defining moment negate everything that came before it. But
Yeah.
you started with asking what theological issues are involved in your own answer.
Yeah.
And some things came to mind for me, but as you have, anticipated the dawn of this episode, since we got this text, what has come up for you? Have you already got a couple of categories?
You know what? I am hoping that this is not a way of you deferring because you don't have a great answer. Because as I reflected on this and I pulled out not some commentaries, excuse me, some systematic theologies. Um, I pulled out Millard Erickson. I pulled out this. You mentioned it earlier before we started. Evangelical theology. Who's that by?
Michael Bird.
Bird. So I pulled out Michael Bird. This is one of the few times I got to the commentaries and thought, guys, you're not asking the same questions I'm asking. I don't find you overly helpful here. And so I am honestly very curious at your thoughts because I don't know that the general questions they seemed to be asking were, is it okay to baptize babies? And is baptism just a symbol?
Well, and I think that latter one is salient here because if you take baptism as something that is essential for salvation, I'll put it that way,
Hmm.
then I think it changes your own answer. And I think even your statement about, hey, if somebody came to me saying exactly what you just said, I would happily, as their pastor, baptize them again. I don't think you would say that if your theological convictions were that something salvific happens with baptism.
That is a very good point. I probably would have far greater concerns if I believed it to be significantly more than a symbol.
And I also think your own statement about uh, baptism being a symbol, you even said that, a symbol of the beginning, shows
Mm.
maybe some emphasis on this maybe marking of seasons idea or this spiritual moment capstone kind of idea, um, a touchstone, not a capstone, a touchstone moment. But I wonder if we think about baptism and start asking the question, what is actually happening in and through baptism? Is it just a symbol? Is there something a little bit more mystical going on here, right? This is the very same type of debate that happens around communion. And, everything from, nothing but symbolism and we do it once a quarter as Baptists to, say the transubstantiation that the Catholic Church believes in. So we have this wide spectrum also in baptism. And I think it's worth asking the question, what's happening here? And then once we know what's happening here, then I think we can ask the question, is it worth doing again? Or is there a reason to do it again?
It's a great point. So, coming from your tradition, what do you think of as what's happening in baptism?
Okay, so I come from the Baptist tradition. Okay, so Baptists are very, very staunch when it comes to baptism, right? Baptism is
Mm-hmm.
believers only baptism, and you do it by full immersion. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We will not debate this issue. It is done. And they're very staunch on the symbolism of both baptism and communion, that these are symbolic acts that represent something that has happened spiritually within you already. And they do not in and of themselves have any salvific power or anything other than just a representation of what has already happened. So my Baptist friends, hopefully you can correct me if I said anything wrong, but I'm fairly certain that that is my tradition's standpoint. Sorry, was I about to interrupt you?
No, I was trying to remember. Did you use the word just? Just, just a symbol.
I did. I did.
Okay.
So as I have divin, again, we're going to codify that word.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah. As I have divin into theology and studying the Bible for myself, not because I want to deny my own tradition's values, but because I really want to understand the scriptural basis for things, I have increasingly appreciated what kind of the mystical side of Christianity, the more contemplative mystical side of Christianity has to offer that my own tradition lacked. And so I'm not like full scale abandoning my Baptist heritage, but and nor am I full scale embracing mystical Christianity. But I mean, we believe that God is a spirit. We believe that God is omnipotent, that he is beyond description, and he is beyond our own finite minds to comprehend. It stands to reason that the things he chooses to do in the world are frequently supernatural, that they are more than what they just appear to be. And so I'm not as willing to just stand in one place and say, this is just a symbol. And yeah, I'm using that word just again. There is something, I think anytime we engage with the divine, we have to be prepared for something more. I don't think we can just say, all I'm doing is a symbolic act. God meets us in these acts and they become more than what they seem. I don't know how to define that, and I'm hoping our conversation will help narrow that down for me, but I feel like I start there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I am intrigued by several things. Number one, the places where baptism is mentioned in the Bible, it comes really close to being a part of what it takes to become a Christian. Like, believe and be baptized and you will be saved kinds of things. So I think that there is something really close there,
Mm-hmm.
and yet not always mentioned. So I'm not 100% sure it is. I like the language you used before, essential for salvation or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, do I think that? No, I don't think it's essential for salvation. However, I think symbols are incredibly potent and powerful. I come back to my experience of great art. Great art, some of the great paintings that I have ever seen. If it was a painting of a spiritual reality or a person or whatever, they weren't the thing itself. And you could very easily say, well, it's just art, it's just paint. And on a technical level, I can't disagree with you. But there is something more complex happening here that invites me into an experience. And I think that when we declare a moment to be sacred and supernatural in our lives, I think God shows up. And he shows up in the midst of that thing in a unique way.
Okay, so yes, I agree with everything you're saying, but what you're saying helps to draw out my own thoughts better. Everything you're saying, I'm replying in my mind, yeah, but. And my yeah, but is I don't know that the example of art goes far enough. And maybe it's because you experience art differently than I do. But can I use an example that is going to make everybody in our audience very uncomfortable?
I am so intrigued to see where this goes. Yes, please make us uncomfortable. That is why we tuned in today.
Well, you're going to get what you tuned in for. So I think when we talk about a symbol, I would liken it to maybe like a wedding ring, right? An ever-present symbol of the fact that I am married and the person to whom I'm married. So that is a symbol. And so we could compare baptism or communion to a symbol like that. Or, and this is where it's going to be uncomfortable for people, we could compare baptism and communion to more of, particularly communion in my mind right now, but to the marital act in the bedroom. And that to me has so much more to it. It is not what it means to be married. It is a part of what it means to be married, but it symbolizes and brings together and unifies the marriage. And I feel like baptism is an act of joining with the Trinitarian God and receiving his blessing and doing exactly as our Lord Jesus did and dying and rising again. And it is a participation in a Trinitarian reality, as is communion. But then communion is also with the body itself, the whole church. And so we're participating both in the Trinitarian God and his sacrifice, but also we're participating in the visible body of Christ at the time of communion. There's more, I'm going to use the word again, participation involved than just the symbol itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I first of all, I think that's a great analogy. And I feel like I need to think about it for like a long time to figure out what I think about it, because I absolutely love the fact that thinking in terms of sex as opposed to thinking in terms of the wedding ring, makes it deeply participatory on both sides.
Mm.
And B, makes it a real experience that is both essential and not essential at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that there is something of that contradiction in the way that I understand baptism in the life of a person, except that it also has this sort of, and this is where I want to be careful of any kind of symbol language or analogical explanation. Sex is obviously not a sort of thing that you do once in a marriage.
Right. In that respect, it might be more analogous to the wedding vows.
Or the wedding ceremony as a whole.
Sure. Or even...
You don't have to have a wedding ceremony to get married.
Sure.
But it is the wedding ceremony that married you if you had one.
Yes. Or maybe even the wedding night, and people say, well, you consummated the marriage. I don't know. We could probably point to all of those in some way.
Well, again, my concern with even consummation in that arena as the analogy is that it makes it seem like the sort of thing you could do over and over again when you get baptized. And my guess is if somebody's getting baptized a bunch of times throughout their life, they're missing something.
Yeah.
And so there is something different that says, this is so important, you generally do it once. Just like You're not going to have a wedding ceremony after your big fight, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's something singular about it. Now, if somebody had been following Jesus for 50 years or had a significant moment and wanted, like, if somebody wants to do a rededication ceremony on their, or a re-wedding ceremony, I've done those. That's fine.
Yeah, like
But
a vow
like a
renewal or
renewal of vows. Thank you. I was completely losing the language there. But yeah, if somebody wanted to do a renewal of vows, that would be great. But even the renewal of vows ceremony would lose its meaning if it were done many times.
Yes.
And so there's this sort of tension for me between how significant it is and therefore how seldom it should be done. And yet, this is you and Jesus, so do what you're going to do. Like, I don't know that I need to tell you.
So then what about the issue of having been baptized as an infant and now as an adult wanting to be either rebaptized or flip it on its head? I had some friends who grew up Lutheran, were baptized as infants, felt that was quite sufficient and no other baptism was necessary, but could not join our Baptist church because they had not gone through, quote, believer's baptism. And so they were like, great, I will perpetually be an attendee then, and I just will not join the church because I think this rule is ridiculous. So what about like that whole issue of being baptized as an infant and then later on?
My favorite thing about this is the fancy words. I know that this is not the most important thing, but for us to go with paedo baptism and credo baptism
Yes.
just proves that some very intelligent theologian somewhere wanted to poke fun at him or themselves.
I don't know. I take it more as like, oh, if we're going to have a theological conversation about this, we must have a theological word to define what it is we mean.
We had to go with rhyming ones, though? Paedo and credo? Really? That just seems like a little over the top, even for the stodgy among us. But again, I have my pastoral answer, which is not fairly non-theological. It was, I did the majority of my pastoral ministry life was in one of the places where Catholicism is deeply embedded into the culture. And we were just not interested in getting in a fight about this. It wasn't important enough. So when somebody came to our church, what we said was, look, these two things, even though they happen to have the same word, they are fundamentally different things. The adult baptism we're talking about is a baptism of confession. You are declaring to the world that you are a follower of Jesus. No one would ever claim that's what infants are doing because they can't be. What an infant is experiencing is I think we used the phrase, a baptism of consecration. We are invoking God's blessing and seeking his act or action in this child's life. And so because they are fundamentally different things, therefore doing one has nothing to do with whether or not you would do the other one. If you have not yet declared Jesus to have forgiven your sins and to be leading your life through baptism of confession, that is something Jesus commands, so that's something you need to do. And I never had any pushback on that, but I'm intrigued by your friend's stance on that. I'm trying to think what I think about that. But again, with that purely pragmatic answer,
I don't know that it was purely pragmatic. Honestly, I think it was, I'm sorry, I'm not accusing you of something. I think it was credo baptism dressed up as practicality. I think you just took all of the theological defenses of believers' baptism only and dressed it up into practical terms.
Yes, I definitely think we landed there. We would not, you could not be a leader in our church if you were not baptized as an adult. So, for example, like we had someone, we were signing them up for uh, small group leadership, and we were kind of going through the basics, like kind of the wide range of things. We were talking about tithing, we were talking about all the kinds of things, and then we're like, "Oh, by the way, you've been baptized as an adult, right? Right?" And he was like, "Oh, no. You know what? Now that I think about it, no, I haven't." So we ended up literally like not that day, but within the next like week or two, we went down to the ocean, baptized him, done, moving on. Okay, let's go. Like, not as part of our normal annual ceremony. Like, just, all right, we got to get you baptized. Let's go baptize you. Moving on.
Yeah, I don't know. I struggle with this one because on the one hand, I grew up Baptist, right? My answer is locked in here, right? There's just not a lot of theological wiggle room, even in my, you know, deconstructed Baptist mind. I'm still landing exactly where you're landing. But I also remember the anguish that put my friends through and that they were really upset about this. And, in some ways, I get it. They're like, I was consecrated for Christ. I was set apart in baptism. I am a believer in Christ. What is left? What am I doing? Am I just following some church rule somewhere for the sake of passing muster when it has nothing to do with my spiritual life in any respect? And I'm not qualified to lead unless I follow your definition of baptism? Like, I start to see how legalistic that feels.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that I would claim, and I have great respect for your friends, whoever they may be, and I'm sorry if they're listening to this. You're free to do whatever you want, and it's totally okay. And you're good. But if we're going to call it legalistic, I'm going to call that legalistic on both sides. I don't think it's just the church. I think it's the people too. A non-legalistic response to a church saying, "Hey, I need you to do this," would be, "All right, whatever. I think it's a little weird, but okay." Like, why not? Doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, I suppose so.
I think it gets complicated on either side because there's often this sort of sense of rigidity, and on some level, and this is going to portray my position on how I think church operates, but I think churches need to err a little bit on the side of rigidity, because when they don't, they get floaty and weird.
Mm.
And if they're going to err a little bit on the side of rigidity, it comes down to the individual person saying, it's kind of like a speed limit at that point. Like, you're asking me to do something. Is it asking me to sin to do this thing? No. So, okay, sure, whatever. Like, I'll just do what you want me to do because it's about the community. It's not about me.
Mm. Now that's an answer I could get behind. It's about the community, not about me. Yeah, I want to participate in this community. This is where I call my church home. And this is the way my church leaders have said, this is how this community operates. Great. I'll do what this community does. I can get behind that.
Yeah. And to me, if you don't feel comfortable, and I am assuming, by the way, again, that whoever these friends are, if they were in this conversation, I am confident they would have reasonable thoughts about all of these things and would be able to. So if you are listening, unnamed friends, I would love to hear your thoughts, because I'm sure that there's something I'm missing that you are perceiving, and I would really love that. I would love to hear that. But anyway, after that caveat, I have no idea what I was about to say. Um, uh, except that, as I was kind of to emphasize my same point there, I really ultimately, one of the reasons I'm more comfortable with child baptism is because I'm nervous about the ways in which our emphasis on individualism, me, my kinds of things,
Yeah.
plays into our theology.
Right.
And
Right.
and so
Well, I was actually struck by that from Michael Bird's perspective, as he was laying out, as a good systematic theologian will do, the arguments on all sides of an issue. He was laying out the arguments that some infant baptizers would give. And one of those is that God doesn't just save individuals. God saves people. God saves families. And one argument is that a baptism by the parents means that the household has been baptized. Those children are growing up in a redeemed house, and that baptism in some way extends to their seed, their progeny, their heirs. And so I don't necessarily agree with that, but I love the spirit of that answer, because it does take us out of our individualism and realize, wait a minute, God's in the business of much more than just me, myself, and I.
well, and to be honest, as you describe that, one of the things I'm reminded of is how often the reason these theological issues get personal, is that we have taken our own spiritual story and poured them into the mold of some theological system or other. And so then to mess with the theological system messes with my story.
Mm.
But if we were able to step back and distinguish my story and my theological system, like if I take my personal story, there is the sort of mainline description of salvation that you just used, that salvation can come to a household, that then the kids growing up in that household are saved because they're in the household. Not saying they don't need to personalize it at some
No,
point,
not
but
saved, not saved, but that baptism, that
yeah,
symbol of belonging has already happened.
yeah, okay, yes. And I would go further than that. I would say, I think on some level, their salvation is an outgrowth of their parents and all of that, right? Like there is something fundamentally entwined in that model. So if I take that as one model, and on the other hand, I take the Baptist model of, and by Baptist, I really just mean evangelical model of, at some point past the age of decision, you have a moment that you draw a line in the sand and cross over it. And before that moment, you weren't saved. And after that moment, you are saved. I could pour my story into either mold
Mm.
really, really easily. And it wouldn't fit super well, but it doesn't fit super well in either. And so it just depends on which one I pour it into first.
Yeah. I like that perspective. And I'm bringing it back to all of the different layers of this conversation. And it helps me recenter on what is most important. What is most important is the genuine connection with God and the act of baptism that accompanies that. That is the most important. And so if you get baptized 5 minutes after accepting Christ, great. And then if you feel like you have a significant momentous moment later on, 20 years later, and you want to get baptized, I don't have a problem with that. Because again, what we're doing is we're talking about connecting between us, our families, whatever, and God. And if that's the spirit in which we're doing it, so much the better.
Absolutely. And whatever that means, like, I'm good. Like, I guess I'm just okay with it. I get the fact that churches have to draw lines in certain things, and that's fine for me. But I think there's some space to kind of just walk in whatever freedom you need to walk in.
All right. Well, to our longtime listener, thank you so much for giving us this topic. I'm afraid we didn't give you a definitive answer, but hopefully we gave you lots of things to add to the conversation. And now we want to continue to add to the conversation. For all those who follow us on social media, come find us on Instagram, on Facebook, on Threads. Share with us your thoughts. If you don't do social media, hit us up on email, onthephonewithjosh@gmail.com. And once again, share this episode with a friend. Start your own conversation. We would love for this to be a springboard for really rich conversation about what baptism is and what it means to you.
All right. Well, my friend, what else are you thinking about? I am curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so this is our very first episode after our Revelations series. And I tell you what, I absolutely loved that Revelation series. That was a spiritually significant series for me. And I cannot believe it, but I am reading a book that is the perfect dovetail to that series.
Ooh, I'm curious to hear.
It's called Exiles by Preston Sprinkle, and it is talking about the theological bearing for the ways in which God's kingdom is different than Babylon's kingdom. What is different about God's kingdom? And he starts all the way back in the Pentateuch and takes it all the way through the rest of the Bible, just doing solid biblical exegesis, defining what the kingdom of God is and why it is so completely different from anything we find in earthly kingdoms. And it is wonderful. I'm only about halfway through it, so if the second half of the book bombs, I'm sorry. But first half of the book has been amazing, and it's been a perfect corollary to our series.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, so I highly recommend it.
Nice.
What about you?
Well, my thought's pretty simple here. I'm continuing my way through the book of Philippians, and Philippians 3:8 says, "Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord." I'm just thinking a lot about what it means to experience something I would otherwise value or otherwise think important or otherwise be passionate about. And to be at a point of saying, man, it is such a loss to experience that because I know it pulls me a little bit away from Jesus or it distracts me from Jesus. I'm just struck by that. That's it. That's my whole thought.
Simple to say, but there's a lot to think on there.
Oh, so much to sit with on that, right?
Yeah. Well, instead of thinking on that further, we should probably just do a Which Josh question because that's, I don't know, important.
Yes, let's do it.
Okay.
Which Josh do you think we should do?
How about which Josh's daughter was born at the last minute?
Ooh, this was me.
Okay. What do you mean at the last minute? Like if she weren't born at that moment, she would like expire? Like there was a timer set and like what would happen?
There was kind of a timer set. So
okay.
My pastor, the lead pastor I was working under at the time, his wife's birthday was the particular day she happened to be due. And so we had joked a number of times that they were going to share a birthday. But as it got later and later, it seemed like maybe she wasn't. And eventually it turned out she was born that day at 11:59. Literally, if she had been born 1 minute later, like I looked at the clock, I checked. If she had been born 1 minute later, it would have been the next day.
Wow. That's awesome.
Isn't that fun?
Yes. Okay. Well, she made it. And I'm sure her life is forever changed as a result.
Yes. She likes her birthday. So I'm pretty sure that she's delighted about that.
All right. Well, should we have another conversation again next week?
That sounds good. I'll look forward to it.
All right. Talk to you then.
All right. Bye.
Bye.